Hi everyone. We're going to concentrate on something a bit loose and textural today. I've got a photograph which is mine of some hawthorn berries in a tree, so it's quite nice. There's lots of crisscrossing happening, so we're going to be a little bit experimental. What I've done is I've drawn in the bigger hawthorn berries, so I've drawn those in, and you can see that I've masked those out. Doesn't have to be exact, as long as you've got a few. It's quite nice that it's following in this line, because that's going to pick out a foreground for us later on. Colours wise, I've got quinachrome gold. If you haven't got quinachrome gold, which most of you won't have, you can either use gamboge or raw sienna. Alizarin crimson, cobalt blue, and then I've got perylene violet. Again, it's an artist quality colour, so you might not have it. You can do a mixture of sepia with a touch of rose. That would give you something very similar. Then I've got a green made up with intense blue and burnt sienna, so that nice dark green. So these are all neat colours. This one's got a little bit of water in. I've also got to hand some salt, some clean film, and some lengths of wool soaked in water. So it can be string, it can be wool, it can be whatever you can find. They're just soaked in water, ready to go. You can use a little bit of ink as well if you want to. I've gone half sheet today, just so that it gives me plenty of time. So we're going to pop water on. Make sure I've got that everywhere. And I'm going to go to my round number 10 and make sure that's nice and clean. And then I'm going to come into the cobalt blue first of all, so I'm dipping straight in. I've got some water on my brush, and I'm going to start to get this really sort of light blue sky in the background. If at any point you think it's too strong, just dip a bit more water in. And give that brush a rinse out, dip into clean water again, and then I'm picking up the quinachrome gold. If you haven't got this, then raw sienna is probably your best bet. Just take a little bit through here. Doesn't have to be everywhere, just so you're picking up some different light. I'm just going to pick up my round number 6 and just come in a little bit more into this quinachrome gold or raw sienna, and I'm just going to pop in the start of some of these golden tree trunks I can see in the background. Don't worry if it's going green further up, it doesn't matter. Okay, and then I'm going to come into my green mix. So don't eliminate all of that gold colour. You want some of it to still be showing through. Take a few bits in here, just dabbing. You can do these later as well. You can add extra there later. I'm going to dip into my violet colour. And this is just giving some depth in places. It's a really nice mix to get this reddy colour with the green. It's quite nice and festive. Okay, I'm then going to pick up my round number 6, a little bit of water on the brush, plenty of alizarin, and I'm going to start to dot a few hawthorn berries. I don't mind if these blur, I want these to blur, so I'm just dotting them in. We can add to them later. Just make sure that they're smaller than the ones that are masked out. If you want to add a bit of ink, you can add a bit of ink at this stage. If you don't, that's absolutely fine. I'm just gonna, that's not mixed very well. Give it a shake. I'm just gonna add a tiny little bit, so I'm showing you what I would do with this ink. Just keep it down in the foliage area. Okay, then comes the experimental bit. So the first is your salt. It's one of those things where you're waiting and waiting. I need this to just start to lose its sheen, really. The bit where I want to pop the salt is on this top section here, where you've got this sort of dappled light. So it's just a sprinkle, don't put too much on. Just take a few little bits up there as well. Now if I just explain, I don't know if you'll be able to see this. What I've done with this soaked wool is I've laid it on the picture at an angle where a branch would be, and because it's soaked and because of how the watercolour is, it's made a watermark, so I want it to do that. So what I'm going to start to do is to pick up bits of wool. Now if I get this at the wrong point, it's going to not do its thing and push the paint away. So I'm hoping I've waited long enough. It's one of those things where you feel like you could wait and wait and wait. I'm going to start by just popping a few on. If I get a few that work and a few that don't work, that's absolutely fine. That's the beauty of random. Obviously this is a thicker area, so I'm trying to build up a few more so that it might look like the thicker tree trunks at the back. But I don't want you to be too precise about it. This might not even work. I might do this and it might not even work. It's just I've had this idea, like I do have these mad ideas, and think I'm going to have a go at that. Where they're all tangled together, that might work really well. I'm just going to stick that on like that. So we're just hoping that this is going to do something. If it doesn't, it'll be fun. Right, so I've got a few on there, and then I'm going to get a piece of cling film. I'm throwing everything at it today. And I'm going to put that over the top and just scrunch in other places, because I want to start to create some texture. My hands are still wet from the wool, so I'm sticking to the cling film elsewhere. You can do it in small sections and then add more. So I can see I've got some really nice patterns happening there already. So this is all about the texture on this bit. Texture, texture, texture. That's what we're going for. So what I'm looking at now when I'm doing the clean film is that I can see bits of texture happening in between. And I'm even going to take a bit just over the sky just to see if I get any bits of texture. I think that's possibly too dry now, but you never know, there might be an odd bit that works well. Okay, I'm going to let that dry now. I'm going to get a cuppa. Okay, so I think it's getting to the point that it's a bit drier. It's obviously not going to dry hugely because the wool's very, very wet. So I'm going to start to peel off carefully just to see if the texture's holding. If the texture's holding enough, then peel and then go with it. The clean film's worked nicely, so we'll take that off first. So I've got some texture happen there. I've got some texture from the salt. Oh, it's stuck to my board at the top. Let's see, have we got anything from the wool? Oh yes, yes. So we're going to take this off. We can whip that off quicker. And then, oh yeah, I love it. Right, I'm going to dry this off now and dry it really well. Okay, So I've dried it really well, and then I'm re-wetting the whole thing. So you must use Saunders paper if you're doing this. Mainly because I don't think I've got it dark enough. I should have been a bit braver. So I'm now going to have to do a second layer. I've got my sponge, and I'm going to come in with the dark green and just start to create a little bit more texture where this foliage is up at the top. So I can create texture with the sponge. What I don't want to do is eliminate all of the texture that I've got. So I've just used all that paint really quickly. Shows you how much paint you need. Mix a bit more green up. So I don't want you to eliminate all the texture. It will show through anyway. We've got transparent layers, and you can reuse the wool, so we can put a bit of the wool back on. But I just needed to bold this bit up at the bottom. What's quite nice is I've got patches where it's actually dry still, and it's worked really nicely. A bit sharper texture. Right, I've rinsed the brush out. Just going to pick up some of this violet colour as well and bring that in places. The trouble is with these colours is they do fade with the hairdryer, so I'm not doing myself any favours by trying to dry it with a hairdryer either. Rinse my sponge out. You can pop a little bit more salt on, you can pop your string back on. I'm just going to come in with a little bit of this gold colour just at the back here. I'm just catching bits of the sponge really. And then I can also bring in a few more hawthorns just by berries, just by dabbing in just a tiny bit. Okay, so I can reuse some of this string if I want to make sure that I'm keeping some of these areas how I had them previously. I really liked that one, so I'm going to try and pop that back in some form. If you go darker, you've got the benefit of hindsight. You might not need to do this second layer. What you can do as well, which I haven't done, is you can put some indents in if you want to start to get a bit of texture, darker texture. So for instance with your knitting needle or whatever you've got, your bamboo skewer, it's quite nice to get a little bit of extra texture in this way as well. and you can add a little bit more salt. I might just throw a bit more salt on for good measure. Try and dry my hands. I'm just going to add a little bit more salt for good measure. Just along. There we go. Okay, I'm going to let that dry and then I'll come back. Okay, so that's dried really nicely now. I'm really happy with the texture, and I'm going to start to come on. I've already started to pop branches on. So what I'm doing is I'm running with whichever you've got, the raw sienna or the quinachrome gold, and just starting to pop in the bigger tree trunks. So you want to make sure your brush is really loaded with paint so you can come back in with it nice and wet. And because these are all transparent colours, you'll find that you can still see everything underneath, and that's really nice texture. I'm just going to start to pull little bits off. So you're going for an impression of, it doesn't have to be exact. I've started from this side as well. I can pull off and across. We're just starting to get some of these branches in. Coming through. Where it's darker, don't worry, just carry on, just pop it in and it'll still add a little bit of texture. Then I'm coming into a bit of sepia. You can use whichever colours you want in these, but sepia is quite a good tree colour. And if you've got the student quality, it's transparent, so it works really nicely because you'll still see these lovely textures. So you're just popping a little bit on as shadow. The beauty of this is it doesn't matter if it watermarks. It's all added to the texture. And because it's still wet, what it's doing is it's following the line. If there's a bit that isn't still wet, like for instance this down here, just take a little bit of water on and just blend that through. So what I want you to do now is just concentrate on getting a few branches and trunks in, doing that with that technique. A few in, and then what I'm going to do as well is to take a few in with watered down sepia. And as I do them, I'm going to indent over so that I get a darker side. Okay, so I'm giving you a bit of a license to fiddle now, and you can pop in little bits of negative painting. So I'm coming in with a green, and I'm picking out little bits of what I would deem as lighter branches. So you can see I've come either side. So it's like I'm drawing the branch, but I'm not going to fill in the branch. What I'm doing is taking some water and wetting either side. So this is then going to give you, and I can give a little bit of line here that's going to indicate that. Little bits like this will just give you an added dimension. You don't need a huge amount of them, so don't feel you have to do loads and loads of fiddling. But it does work really nicely to have a few. So if I pop one in here, I've already sort of popped a tiny little bit of something in there, so I just want to darken that. Then maybe I could take one across here. The thing is to not lose all the texture you've created. You just want to pull a few little bits out. I quite like the fact that I've just got that bit of the branch showing. So if I just wet just around here, just so it's not too sharp anywhere. And in fact I can probably just wet a couple of places there and it will just pull in and work quite nicely. Let's do another one just so you've got a good idea of exactly what I mean when I'm doing this. Where can I pop another one? I've popped something, a little branch in there. Okay, let's do a couple this side. Is this on the camera yet? So if I come, say, this way, and then a bit this way, so I'm creating a nice branch, and then I'm wetting either side. If when you wet it doesn't move enough, take a bit more paint into the wet area. You don't want it to look like a sharp outline like that, so if I just take a bit more of the green in on the wet area to just blend it out a little bit. So you can do a few of those. You don't need a huge amount. It gives just an extra bit of depth and an added dimension. I'm going to pop one in here as well. And this side, add a bit of extra paint just to make sure that it doesn't look too pronounced. In fact, I'm going to take a little bit of this just up here. Just to start to define that edge of the tree. So those little bits can help greatly. I'm just going to pop a little bit in there just to define the edge of that tree trunk a little bit. So it's all sort of little bits of fiddling that can work really nicely. I'm going to pop a bit of dark in there. The little bits of dark make all the difference. You can use a little bit of ink on there as well if you want. I'm quite liking the fact that I've just got loads of added texture here. There's bits that I love so much that I just don't want to touch, and it's knowing which bits not to touch. Even I can sometimes make a mistake and think, oh, I've ruined it. Pop a little bit more there. So this is helping come behind these hawthorns and also define that tree trunk a little bit more, just to add a bit more depth. Okay, so I'm going to dry this off really well, and then we're going to look at the berries and the front branch. Okay, so I've dried that really well, and I'm coming in using the violet colour just to create the branch. I'm using my number 6 and just painting on directly, just making sure that I'm getting where the hawthorn berries with the masking fluid are. So because this violet is a slightly warmer colour, it should stand forward. If you want to add a little bit of the red, that would work as well. The alizarin crimson in there. It's just making sure it's thick enough that it's gonna cover and show. You could also add a little bit of sepia if you wanted to. What you want is this flow through from the picture. It's going to create this nice effect. There's another branch this side. There's lots of little bits coming off this branch. You get the spiky bits. So you can pop those on them right in the light there. That's the trouble with these dark days now. You can't see properly. And then I've got a branch that's coming this way, so I'll do the big branch. the bits that come off. So you're just making sure you're connecting every one of these hawthorn berries, so you don't end up with floating berries. That wouldn't work. Okay, so I'll dab a tiny bit of the alizarin crimson on him in places as well. Just to help that to stand out. And I'm going to dab into a tiny bit of sepia ink as well. You can just use normal sepia if you haven't got the ink or don't like using the ink. Just because I want this to really sort of stand out, to get that foreground effect. The ink always does that really well. So I'm just adding a bit in places. And you can pull that knitting needle through as well. That'll give an added bit of spikiness. You can pull it out in places. It should work really well, moving the paint that hasn't dried yet. There's a few extra hawthorn spikes. You could also do this with a pen if you wanted to. So I'm just capturing some of the sepia on each of these branches now because I don't want them to not stand out. Okay, I'm going to dry that off and then we'll do the berries. Okay, so I've rubbed the masking fluid off now and we're going to take these one by one. So if you can leave a tiny white dry highlight on each one, it will work. If you can't, don't worry, you can lift it out. It might not happen on all of them. So I've taken a bit of water on, I've made sure my water's nice and clean. So what needs to be nice and fresh. In fact, the next one I'm going to do, because they're so small, I'm not even going to take any water on. So I'm going to do a couple. So you can see what I'm doing. Because that one's far too wet for me to put anything else on at the minute. So I'm looking to keep a tiny white highlight. Create a berry. I need to do these one by one. The one next to it needs to be done when that one's dry. I'm trying to look where the light is on each of them. Once I brush out, I'm going to pick up a bit of my violet colour and just drop a bit in whilst it's still damp so that I get that bit of shadow on one side. Then I'm going to dry my brush, so I'm using a round number 6 for all of this, and then I'm dipping into a tiny bit of ink, or it could be neat sepia, and I'm going to create that little dark bit. And in each one it's in a different place. With my rigger or line writer, if there's any little the spiky bits, I can pop those in as well. Right, it's dispersed a little bit too much, just because we're a bit wet still. So I'm just gonna lift some of that damp ink out. So this is just with a dry brush. Just so it's not gone too far. So can you see? Just dry, clean brush, just lift that ink out so that you've still got that point. Right, I'll do a few more so you've got the idea. So on with your alizarin crimson. Get the shape of one berry in. Then dry your brush off, come into your violet, and you're going to pop a bit of shadow in. I'm going to come back into these ones now, just to create them a bit better. It's just biding my time till I can see that it's nearly dry, and then you pop that dark bit in. I did it a bit too soon. That one is there. So vary where it is. That one, it's there. That one, it's at the bottom there. Okay, so I'm going to do the rest of those and then I'll come back. Okay, so I've got those in now. The last thing you can do, and again it's not essential, but if you want a few extra hawthorn berries in where they are in the mid-ground, then you can pop a few in, a bit more defined with a brush. So this is just my round number 6. I'm just dotting a few in. So it's a bit more defined, and then I'm going to spritz it. If you're a bit nervous, you don't have to do this at all. It still works without it. You can also pop a few down at the bottom. So do a few and then spritz. Just make sure they're smaller than the ones you've got in the foreground. And if you want to do a few in within your foliage, you can do a few as well. With something like this, less is more, I think. Probably have a few up here. So you're just watching, you want them to move. If it's not moving, then take a tiny bit more paint on. Don't overflow it with water, or else it'll spread everywhere. I'm quite happy with that. They're just blurring enough a bit more water there and a bit more water at the top. Okay, I'm going to dry that off and then that's finished.